Welcome to the Sober and Happy podcast, where we talk about all things recovery related, how to navigate the challenges that we'll face along the way on our journey towards our best lives, and how we could go from living a life of simply just being sober to a life where we're both sober and happy. Today, I want to tackle one of the biggest questions in recovery. Why do people relapse? If you Google it, you'll get various lists of the top 10 reasons people relapse. If you've read any recovery literature, you might have seen the acronym HALT, which means we're more vulnerable to relapse when we're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. But what if I told you that when we take a step back and look at relapse, there really is only one reason that we relapse? So what is that reason, and what steps can we take to avoid it? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today. So buckle up. This is going to be a great episode. Welcome back. Today we'll dive into a topic that many in recovery face at some point, which is relapse. More specifically, I want to explore the cause of relapse and dig deeper into the emotional and mental space that leads someone to take that first drink or use again. When it comes to relapse, we often focus on the triggers that lead us to that point. Maybe we were around a certain group of people, visited a place where we used to drink, or experienced a significant emotional trigger like anger, sadness, or loneliness. These things are all important and play a role in relapse, but they are just surface level. What they often mask are the deeper emotions behind that moment when the idea of drinking or using seems like the solution. The reality is that we relapse because in that specific moment, the idea of drinking sounds better than the idea of being sober. Many people will debate me on this topic and say things like, "No, I relapsed because I had a craving," or tell me about a life event that was stressful and caused them to relapse. Those definitely can be contributing factors, but if cravings were the cause of relapse, we would relapse every time we had a craving. My point is that when we still have a strong desire to stay sober, we could fight through cravings and we can navigate stressful life situations. It's only when the desire to drink grows stronger than the desire to stay sober that we finally give in. Let me give you an example. Imagine you have a fuel gauge inside of you, much like the one you'd see inside of a car. On one side of the gauge is your desire to stay sober, and on the other side is your desire to drink or use. When you're in a good place mentally and emotionally, the needle is comfortably pointing towards sobriety. You're fueled up with motivation and purpose. Everything feels manageable, and you have the resources to keep going in the right direction. But as life throws challenges your way, stress, unresolved emotions, or feelings of boredom start to drain that fuel tank. Slowly, the needle starts creeping towards the middle of the gauge. Maybe you've been neglecting self-care, or the stress of work or relationships is piling up and you haven't addressed those feelings head on. You start to notice old cravings come back, or the idea of drinking begins to feel more tempting. This is when you enter what I call the danger zone. The needle is hovering right in the middle and you're teetering between staying sober and wanting to give in. At this point, you still have a choice. You could refuel with positive actions or by re-engaging with things that worked in the past that you may have begun to neglect. However, if you ignore the warning signs and keep depleting your fuel without taking action, that needle keeps moving towards the side of drinking. Eventually, you will hit what I called the F-it point. This is when you've run out of emotional fuel and staying sober feels too hard. At that moment, the desire to drink or use outweighs your desire to stay sober and you give in. That needle has hit empty, and that's when relapse happens. The key is recognizing when you're in the danger zone before you hit the F-it point. Just like a car, you need regular refueling. The closer you are to empty, the more vulnerable you are. Now let's break that down. Why does drinking or using sound like the better option at that moment? One of the biggest causes is unresolved emotional discomfort. Many of us used alcohol or drugs to cope with difficult emotions, whether it is anger, sadness, fear, shame, or guilt. When we get sober, those emotions don't just disappear. In fact, they could intensify because we no longer have our go-to coping mechanism. Imagine a pressure cooker. All those emotions that we haven't dealt with are building up inside. If we don't have a release valve for those feelings, eventually the pressure becomes too much. The idea of drinking or using offers an instant release. In the short term, it feels like the quickest way to turn down that internal pressure. In that moment, even though we know the consequences of drinking again, we feel the pain from that built-up pressure is greater than the pain that will come from the consequences of drinking, and our desire to drink becomes stronger than our desire to stay sober. If you think about it, it really isn't about wanting to drink or use drugs at that point. It's about not wanting to feel the way that you are feeling at that moment. That is the F-it point. If we never deal with the emotions that are causing the pressure to build up in the first place, we will get stuck in the cycle of them building up, drinking to release the pressure, and right back to the pressure building up again. If you're struggling with where to start learning to cope with your emotions, check out episode 22 of this podcast. Another contributing factor is when we lose the sight on why we got sober in the first place. When we are newly sober, it's very easy to remember why we need to stop drinking, as the consequences of our drinking are usually very raw. It's like when you bite the inside of your cheek. For the first couple of days, you will be reminded constantly that you bit the inside of your cheek with everything you eat or drink, and every time you accidentally bite that now swollen part of your mouth. But as days go on, your cheek begins to heal and the swelling goes down. Certain foods don't burn as much when you eat them, and eventually the pain completely subsides. Sobriety is the same. Think of how many times you've sworn off drinking in the morning and are drunk again by that night. We have very short-term memories about the pain from the consequences of drinking, so when we start accumulating days, weeks, and even years of sobriety, that pain often becomes a long-lost memory. Not only does memory fade, but it can become very selective the longer we stay sober. How often have we heard or told ourselves, it wasn't that bad, or maybe I could control it this time? This is one of the most dangerous thought patterns because it completely distorts reality. When we romanticize our past drinking or using, we conveniently forget the negative consequences, the broken relationships, the lost jobs, and the mornings filled with regret. We focus only on the moments when drinking or using felt fun or provided relief. These all begin to reduce our internal dial on the reasons not to drink, which begins to push us closer to that danger zone. But the goal isn't to keep those negative emotions fresh and raw, because if we do that, we'll live in a constant state of fear, guilt, and shame. It is more important to focus on building up reasons to stay sober, because our initial reasons may also fade with time. I can't tell you how many people I have known who have lost their kids due to addiction and were brought to tears of joy with moments like the first time they got to pick their kids up from school, only to hear them complaining about the pickup line outside their kids' school only a couple of months later. I'm not saying they should be happy to sit in the line outside of school every day, but if we forget the purpose for getting sober and don't expand on that reason, it too will fade away, which reduces the reasons to stay sober on our sobriety gauge. For example, I got sober initially because I wanted to stop breaking my mom's heart. I had a moment of clarity that showed me the type of son I was, which disgusted me. That was enough for me to stop. But if I used that as my sole reason to stay sober, then my purpose would be simply not being a bad son. I didn't make my mom cry today. Another successful day. In the early days, that was enough, but that wasn't a sustainable purpose to stay sober, so I had to grow on that. I had to work on building and becoming a better son and explore other areas and opportunities that would also become reasons to stay sober. Sobriety is hard work. It requires daily effort, and sometimes we could get tired. Maybe we stopped practicing gratitude or forgotten why we wanted a better life. When we lose touch with the positive reasons for staying sober, it becomes easier to justify picking up that first drink. When you're in the thick of a difficult moment, it's easy to think, what's the point? You forget the peace and joy that sobriety has brought you. The memories of the consequences of drinking start to fade, and when life gets challenging, the reasons to drink start to become stronger than the reasons to stay sober. When we relapse, we often just look at the last thing, the straw that broke the camel's back, and point at that as the cause of relapse. But it is the collective things that shifted our dial from having more reasons to stay sober than getting drunk to that danger zone and eventually the F-it point. If we want long-lasting sobriety, if we want a life that isn't a constant struggle to stay sober, we must look at the deeper reasons that are driving us to the point where drinking sounds better than staying sober. That is the essence of a fulfilling life. That is what being sober and happy is all about. Thank you for listening to this episode, and I hope you enjoy this podcast. Here's your weekly challenge. I want you to imagine that internal gauge I talked about between wanting to stay sober and wanting to drink. Where's the needle on your gauge? If you're in the danger zone, look at what might have caused the shift and ask yourself what steps you could take to move that needle again. If you do not have a process for examining that, I recommend going back and listening to one of my early podcasts, episode number 10, where I discuss how to learn from our past relapses and how to identify the root causes. That is my challenge for you this episode. New episodes come out each Friday, so I look forward to connecting with you next week. And as always, thank you so much for listening and keep living sober and happy.